The furnace had been cold for hours. The fire was out. The dampers were set. When the access door swung open, air moved the wrong direction. It pulled inward. Men felt their sleeves tighten. Tools began to slide across iron plating toward the opening. There was no flame inside, no heat, no combustion of any kind. The danger was supposed to be over. The furnace stood silent in the foundry hall, its fire extinguished according to procedure, its interior cooling in the February air. It had been shut down 36 hours prior. The coal feed had been stopped. The grates had been cleared. The dampers at the base and stack had been adjusted to neutral positions, isolating the combustion chamber from atmospheric draw. Temperature readings taken through observation ports showed the refractory brick had cooled below the threshold for maintenance entry. The superintendent signed the clearance. The work crew assembled near the access door with tools, brushes, and lanterns. They had done this before. Every furnace required periodic inspection. Brick linings wore down. Slag built up along the lower walls. Dampers needed adjustment. It was routine work, dangerous only when the fire was live. The fire was not live. The men checked their equipment. They reviewed the entry sequence. The youngest among them, a helper named Mills, would go in first with a lantern to verify conditions. 2 men would follow to inspect the lower chamber. The rest would remain outside to manage tools and communicate through the access. There was no discussion of airflow. There was no concern about pressure. The furnace was cold. The air inside it was still. That was the assumption. The access door was unbolted. The iron wheel turned. The heavy hatch, set into the furnace wall at chest height, swung outward on its hinges, and the air moved. It was not violent at first, just a breath of movement, a stirring that brushed past the men standing closest to the opening. One of them remarked on it. A draft, he said. From the stack, probably. But the stack damper was closed. The movement continued. A steady, soft inward flow as though the furnace were inhaling. Mills held his lantern near the threshold. The flame bent inward toward the dark. He paused. The foreman told him to proceed. Mills leaned through the opening, extending the lantern into the chamber. The light revealed brick walls, still faintly warm to radiant heat, and the empty grate below. No visible fire, no embers. The air smelled of ash and iron oxide. Mills called back that it looked clear. He braced himself on the edge of the access and swung one leg inside. The airflow increased. It was perceptible now, a tangible pull against fabric and skin. The lantern flame stretched horizontal, pointing deeper into the furnace. One of the men outside noticed his cap brim lifting slightly, tugged by the current. Another felt his shirt collar tighten against his neck. The foreman stepped closer to the opening and put his hand into the airstream. It was cool. Not cold, but cooler than the air in the foundry hall. And it was moving with purpose, drawn inward as though something beyond the chamber were pulling it through. He told Mills to hold position. Mills, halfway through the access, gripped the iron frame and steadied himself. The pull was stronger now. Loose dust on the foundry floor began to skitter toward the furnace. A hammer left on the ground nearby shifted an inch. Then another. No one spoke. They watched the hammer slide across the floor. Mills pulled himself back out of the access. His hands were shaking. He said the air was moving hard inside, sweeping along the brick walls toward the rear of the chamber, and he could feel it tugging at him when he leaned in. The foreman ordered everyone back from the opening. The airflow did not stop. It intensified. A wooden toolbox sitting 3 feet from the furnace wall began to scrape forward, slowly at first, then faster. One of the men grabbed it. The box pulled against his grip. He had to brace his legs to hold it in place. Another man tried to close the access door. He swung it toward the frame, but the air resistance pushed back, and when he released his hold, the door swung open again, held wide by the inward current. Papers on a workbench across the hall lifted and fluttered toward the furnace. A tin cup rolled. The youngest worker's cap was pulled from his head and vanished into the dark opening. The men retreated further. They could hear it now. A low, sustained rushing sound, like wind funneled through a narrow gap, but coming from inside the furnace. The foreman shouted for the stack damper to be checked. 2 men ran to the exterior ladder and climbed to the top of the stack. They found the damper plate seated and locked. No air was escaping upward. The draw was not coming from the stack. It was coming from somewhere else. Inside the foundry, the pull grew worse. A section of rope coiled near the furnace wall unwound itself and slithered across the floor toward the access. Tools clattered. A man who ventured too close to the opening felt his balance shift. He staggered forward, caught himself, and scrambled back. His coat had been pulled tight against his chest, the fabric drawn inward as though hands were gripping it from inside the furnace. He said it felt like falling, not downward, but forward into the dark. The foreman ordered the room cleared. The men complied, but slowly, watching the furnace as they backed toward the exit. The access door stood open. The air kept moving, and nothing inside was burning. The superintendent arrived within the hour. He stood at a safe distance from the furnace and observed the phenomenon. Air was being drawn into the combustion chamber at a rate he could not immediately explain. The stack damper was confirmed closed. The ash pit damper below the grate was closed. There were no openings in the refractory lining. The furnace was sealed, or should have been. He ordered wet canvas tarps brought in to cover the access door. 4 men draped the heavy fabric over the opening and weighted the edges with iron bars. The canvas bellied inward, pulled taut by the airflow, but it held. The rushing sound muffled. For a moment, it seemed the situation was contained. Then the canvas began to tear. The fabric split along one edge, and air screamed through the gap. The men pulled the tarp away before it was sucked entirely into the furnace. The superintendent tried another approach. He ordered the stack damper opened, thinking that allowing air to escape upward might equalize the pressure. The damper was unlocked and swung wide. The draw did not diminish. If anything, it increased. Air now moved through both the access and the stack, feeding the interior from below and venting nothing. The furnace had become a corridor for airflow with no apparent destination. One of the engineers present suggested the rear flue might be open. A team was sent to inspect the ductwork behind the furnace. They found all downstream dampers closed and sealed. No air was passing through. The flow had to be going somewhere. It had to be filling something, displacing something, moving toward equilibrium. But the chamber had been open to atmosphere for 36 hours. It should have equalized long ago. The superintendent ordered calculations. Volume of the furnace chamber, volume of connected flues and plenums, estimated temperature drop since shutdown, rate of gas contraction. The numbers were prepared, but no one present could interpret them in time. The airflow continued. Men stood in the hall and watched tools slide toward the furnace. They heard the sound of rushing air and felt the temperature drop near the opening. Some of them began to understand that the danger had not passed when the fire went out. It had only changed form. The explanation came later, assembled from testimony, measurement, and engineering review. The furnace, when operational, had maintained an internal temperature exceeding 2,000 degrees. The combustion gases inside, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor, residual carbon monoxide, had expanded to enormous volume under that heat. The furnace chamber, the flues, the passages, and plenums, all filled with hot gas at elevated pressure, held in equilibrium by the draft and the burn. When the fire was extinguished, the gases began to cool. Cooling gas contracts, molecules slow, pressure drops, volume decreases. In a small system, this happens quickly and equalizes with outside air through leaks and vents. In a large industrial furnace, with refractory brick walls 18 inches thick and dampers sealing the major passages, the process is slow. The gas inside cools over hours, over days. As it cools, it shrinks. The pressure inside the chamber falls below atmospheric. The furnace becomes, in effect, a vacuum. Not a perfect vacuum, but a significant pressure differential. When the access door was opened, outside air rushed in to fill the void. The faster the air entered, the more it cooled the remaining gas inside, accelerating the contraction, deepening the vacuum, increasing the draw. The system fed itself. The furnace pulled air because it had been hot. It pulled air because it was cooling. It pulled air because men had assumed that shutdown meant safety. The draft, which during operation had been carefully managed to sustain combustion, had reversed. Instead of hot gas rising and escaping, cool air was falling and entering. The stack, rather than expelling exhaust, was channeling air downward into the collapsing pressure zone. The magnitude of the force was a function of volume and temperature change. A furnace 20 feet high and 12 feet in diameter, with auxiliary chambers and flue networks, could contain thousands of cubic feet of gas. A temperature drop of 2,000 degrees could reduce that volume by half or more. The resulting inward pull could exceed several hundred pounds of force at the access point, enough to move tools, enough to move men, enough to pull someone inside if they lost their footing near the threshold. No fire was needed, no combustion, no failure of equipment, only cooling, contraction, and the physics of pressure seeking equilibrium. The furnace was eventually vented and equalized. The access door was secured. The maintenance entry was postponed until pressure could be confirmed neutral. No one had been pulled inside, though several men came close. The incident was recorded in the foundry's operational log with a note about airflow during shutdown. Changes were made to procedure. Future entries would require verification of internal pressure using manometers installed at access points. Dampers would be opened in sequence to allow gradual equalization before any hatch was unsealed. Workers would be briefed on the behavior of cooling gases in large enclosed volumes. The assumption that a cold furnace was a safe furnace was quietly discarded, but the feeling remained. The men who had been there, who had watched tools slide across the floor and felt their clothing pull tight, carried a wariness around industrial equipment that others did not share. They understood that danger could persist in the absence of flame. That shutdown was not the same as inert. That air itself, moving with purpose through a pressure gradient, could become as threatening as any fire. The furnace stood in the hall for another 40 years. It was fired and cooled hundreds of times. Workers entered it for maintenance, for inspection, for repair. They did so carefully. They checked pressure. They opened vents. They never again assumed that stillness meant safety. And on cold mornings, when the foundry was quiet and the furnaces were down, some of them would stand near the access doors and listen, just to be sure the air was not moving the wrong way.